Hello viewers, and welcome back to my channel. And this video is going to be doing an update about the saga of Juan Orlando Hernandez, the ex-president of Honduras. Many of my longtime viewers have been watching my videos that are related to Juan Orlando Hernandez. But for those who are watching my videos for the first time, I'll give some background. Juan Orlando Hernandez was the very corrupt, authoritarian, autocrat president of Honduras from 2014 until 2022, and during those 8 years he was a close ally of the United States government, despite the fact that he was very corrupt, repressive, engaged in all kinds of criminal behavior, and was a very repressive dictator in his country, and yet was praised by the U.S. as an ally and had a lot of allies in the United States. Once he left office in January 2022, the United States turned on him, and the U.S. indicted him and demanded him to be extradited to the United States, which is very rare for the U.S. to extradite a president from another country be put on trial in the United States. So Juan Orlando Hernandez was extradited to the United States in 2022. 2 years later, 2024, his trial finally began, and he ended up being convicted and found guilty by an American jury. After being convicted, he has now recently been sentenced. He is now going to spend 45 years in U.S. prison in the state of New York. And the bigger thing to talk about is why none of the Americans who worked with him are being held accountable. So going back, talking about America's relationship with Juan Orlando Hernandez. Juan Orlando Hernandez was a very close ally to the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and even the Biden administration in 2021, where he's working with them. Juan Orlando Hernandez had a close relationship with American military officials, since the United States has had an air base in Honduras since 1983. He was friends with American senators as well, like Senator Marco Rubio. And during the trial of Juan Orlando Hernandez, he was actually calling on a lot of these people, like Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, General John Kelly, and so forth, to actually come testify at his trial to speak in his defense. And none of these American officials or politicians came to his trial, and they all distanced themselves from him, tried to ignore him, and pretended that they were never friends with him to begin with. They disowned him. There's a lot I want to actually unload about this whole Juan Orlando Hernandez saga. And one of the things I also want to talk about is the press coverage of it, especially in the American mainstream news. Since Juan Orlando Hernandez was extradited to the United States in 2022, the American mainstream news, such as ABC, CBS, NBC News, as well as CNN and Fox News and so forth, and the major American newspapers of the United States, really did a terrible job of covering all this. They tried to make it that just Juan Orlando Hernandez was a lone actor in his evil deeds. Most of them barely even mentioned how the United States was close allies with Juan Orlando Hernandez while he was president. And they didn't even mention, all the different people in the U.S. government, and how the Trump administration and the Obama administration had closely worked and ignored the corruption of Hernandez and talking about how all the migrant caravans coming from Honduras were leaving Honduras during his presidency. The American media barely even talked about a lot of the horrible stuff that Juan Orlando Hernandez was doing when he was the president. And there's a lot of things to talk about that. How the mainstream news in the United States oftentimes does not want to try to hold the United States government accountable, but rather become just a parrot, a lackey for the U.S. government. They want to be close to the United States government, and a lot of the corporate interests and so forth with the mainstream media doesn't want to upset the balance with power, those in government power. The only news outlets here in the United States that did cover the whole saga of Juan Orlando Hernandez, his trial, and the United States government's role in all of it were alternative media, such as Democracy Now!, The Intercept, Mint Press News. These small handful of alternative news sites in the United States were the ones willing to call out the hypocrisy and corruption of the United States government in working with Juan Orlando Hernandez and then later turning against him and betraying him, and how the U.S. knew all along who they were working with. The other people that also covered this news extensively were Spanish-language news networks such as Univision. They also did deep coverage of this whole Juan Orlando Hernandez court saga. But the mainstream news made sure to avoid talking about America's complicity and support of Hernandez when he was president, and how, and even they did not talk about the U.S. military air base in Honduras, the Soto Cano air base, that we have an air base there, and how the United States trains the military and security forces of Honduras. In the context also of this Juan Orlando Hernandez saga was how the United States also extradited the former top commander of the Honduras police, Juan Carlos Bonilla Valadares. He's also in U.S. custody right now. He was extradited, and he pled guilty to all the charges against him related to drug trafficking, weapons, and killings, extrajudicial killings. And the United States media ignored and omitted any information about how the U.S. military station in Honduras trains the police of Honduras, who are very corrupt and brutal. What I want to reiterate is that this Juan Orlando Hernandez saga is also a reflection of just bad American foreign policy and intervention in Latin America. The United States has a long history of intervention in Honduras, which I've talked about, including during the early 20th century, the 1900s to the 1920s, where the U.S. actually did outright military invasions of Honduras, and how the United States set up an air base, which exists to this day, the Soto Cano Air Base, in 1983 in Honduras, which was part of the whole Contra War with Nicaragua, and how Honduras, after the military coup of 2009, had really destabilized into a much more violent, out-of-control country with political assassinations and repression, and the U.S. military station in Honduras was complicit in arming and training the brutal security forces of Honduras with their horrible human rights record and corruption, and the United States government's lies claiming that it's in Honduras to fight drug trafficking, trying to improve lives in Honduras, trying to help stabilize the crime situation, and none of those goals have ever been accomplished since 1983. And Honduras has been one of the major sources of migrant caravans leaving to go to the U.S.-Mexican border. And the United States gets overwhelmed by Honduran migrants, and it at the same time is responsible for why those migrants leave their country, where the U.S. supports very violent, repressive, corrupt leaders in Honduras who are there supporting American foreign interests, business interests, American multinational corporations in the fruit industry, coffee, textiles, and so forth, who operate for cheap in Honduras. At the same time, these leaders friendly to American interests abuse their country and their countrymen, leaving the country poor and repressed, forcing many people to want to leave their country, and then trying to come to the United States. And the U.S. military train, as I said, the security forces of Honduras, who treat the rest of their population horribly, and drug trafficking is doing quite well in Honduras, even after 1983. And it leaves a lot of questions. If the United States knew Juan Orlando Hernandez and his family had been involved, according to the U.S. Justice Department, since 2004 in drug trafficking, the U.S. government knew they were bad all along and worked with them and played a double game. And the United States, there's a questions, how much really is the U.S. military allowing the drug trafficking to flourish in Honduras? The U.S. military, if they're honest, could stop it anytime they want. And yet the drug trafficking going through Honduras and the smuggling is doing quite well, despite all the U.S. military personnel stationed there for 40 years. And probably, just like in the case of Panama, with that situation in the 80s and 70s, I strongly suggest that there are probably U.S. military personnel taking a cut from the drug trade. And it's just too much of a big business that really no one wants to eliminate it, even though of the harmful effects of drug addiction and drug use. And all of these politicians, including the United States and Honduras and so forth, they're all corrupt. You can't trust any of them. Politics is just so dirty and corrupt. And at this point, who even believes in politicians anymore? How naive are we? It is disgustingly hypocritical how some American government officials, including in the U.S. State Department, are celebrating the conviction and sentencing of Juan Orlando Hernandez. In particular, American ambassadors to Honduras, such as current American ambassador to Honduras, Laura Dogu, who is in a statement saying it's a victory for the Honduran people and talking about how awful Juan Orlando Hernandez was. And just a few years ago, the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Honduras was praising Juan Orlando Hernandez, even as the Honduran people were actively protesting against Juan Orlando Hernandez and demanding that he resign. At that time, people in the U.S. State Department, the U.S. government, they were defending and standing with Juan Orlando Hernandez, and they were ignoring the Honduran people. And to act like they care now about the Honduran people is so fake. It's disgustingly fake. And I hope the Honduran people can see past the fake nonsense of people like U.S. Ambassador Laura Dogu, who has no respect for Honduras, its people, and its sovereignty. Shame on them. So with this whole Juan Orlando Hernandez saga, Hernandez now joins the list of many other foreign leaders and dictators that the United States government worked with and used and then threw away and turned against once they were no longer useful. Juan Orlando Hernandez was a puppet of the United States government, their man in Honduras, and the United States owns him. They used him, and now he's in U.S. prison. The United States owns him. Hernandez is just like other leaders such as General Manuel Antonio Noriega of Panama, who was a U.S. ally, and then later the U.S. turned against him. They overthrew him in an invasion. And other leaders like Anastasio Somoza and Jean-Claude Duvalier and General Raul Cedras of Haiti. And the list goes on. And General Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay and others, where the United States used leaders, dictators for their own short-sighted goals, and then later the United States turned against them and sometimes helped overthrow them and then put them in jail. And this is a horrible policy of interference in Latin America, which has only made the immigration crises worse. And then the result is all these migrants trying to come to the United States, leaving their ruined countries.